Was Ireland really neutral in the Second World War? It's a pretty interesting question. So maybe a good place to start is, strange enough, at the end of the war. But in 1945, after the end of the Second World War, Winston Churchill would accuse the Irish government in Dublin of having frolicked with Adolf Hitler and then later Japan. But this was pretty misleading, and actually Winston Churchill himself knew that this was not true. Now, the Irish government had adopted a position of neutrality in 1939, but they hadn't really followed that to the letter of the law. And to understand exactly who the Irish government did actually support in the Second World War, we need to next return to 1939 and look at why exactly they had adopted a position of neutrality at the outset of the conflict. So in 1939, when the Second World War broke out, the Irish government of Eamon de Valera in Dublin announced that they would remain neutral in the conflict. Now, this surprised no one at the time. In the preceding years, the government in Dublin had made it very clear that they were going to remain neutral in any international conflict. But also, it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of other countries adopted a position of neutrality, most famously the United States. So the USA would only break its neutrality in 1941 when it was bombed by the Japanese Empire at Pearl Harbor. So in the early stage of the war at least, the government in Dublin was not unique or alone when it adopted a position of neutrality. Indeed, alongside the US, there were numerous other countries in Europe and across the world that adopted a similar position. However, let's hone in on Ireland and try and understand exactly why the government in Dublin decided to remain neutral in the conflict. So firstly, Ireland didn't have a large army or navy or air force and wouldn't have made much of a material difference to either side of the conflict. And secondly, it did have a lot to lose. So for example, if Ireland had supported the Allies openly, it would have been bombed by the Nazis and possibly even invaded. Alongside that though, Ireland had some historical and political problems with joining the Allies. So in 1939, at the outbreak of the war, this was just 18 years after the conclusion of the Irish War of Independence. And that war had seen the British Army commit numerous atrocities in Ireland. On top of this, most Irish people in 1939 considered Northern Ireland to be a continued British occupation of Irish soil. So at the outbreak of the conflict, Ireland had a pretty strained relationship with Britain, and it wasn't really politically feasible for any Irish government to go to war on the side of Britain in 1939. Now, I should say there was no possibility of Ireland supporting the Nazis. That was never entertained. If Ireland was going to break its neutrality in 1939, it would have joined the war on the side of the Allies. However, even though Ireland declared itself neutral at the outset of the conflict, it didn't really pursue a strict policy of neutrality. Indeed, in hindsight, it's very clear that the Irish government wanted one side to win the war and actually went to considerable lengths to ensure the victory that they thought would benefit Ireland most. So let's look at exactly what the Irish government did and didn't do in the Second World War. So as I've said, at the outset of the conflict, the government in Dublin declared itself neutral, and that meant that it would in no way, shape or form support either side of the conflict. Or that's theoretically what neutrality meant, because very quickly after the war began, the government in Dublin recognised that an Allied victory was in Ireland's best interests, and in fact a Nazi victory would have been devastating for Ireland. It's very difficult to see how Ireland would have remained independent had the Nazis won the war. So after they recognised this, even though they remained neutral, they began to pursue policies that benefited the Allies. Now, these were carried out largely in secrecy because the Irish government were determined, outwardly at least, to remain neutral to avoid Nazi Germany attacking Ireland. But let's look at some of those ways that they aided the Allies. So one simple way was the way they treated airmen who dropped down into Ireland during the conflict. So lots of airmen landed in Ireland in error during the conflict. These were both Germans and Allies, both British and Americans. Now, if an Allied airman landed on Irish territory, they were simply driven to the border with Northern Ireland, from where they returned to the units. However, German airmen who landed in Ireland were interned in prison camps for the rest of the war. Now, that was one small way, but Ireland supported the Allies in far more important and strategic ways. One of these, for example, was something called the Donegal Corridor. So the Donegal Corridor was a way that Ireland essentially supported the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic. So Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, and because of this, the Allies had numerous bases in Northern Ireland, and these would play a key role in the Battle of the Atlantic because it allowed Allied airplanes fly out into the Atlantic to protect convoys and attack German ships in the Atlantic Ocean. But there was one problem with these bases in Northern Ireland. In order to get out into the Atlantic, they had to fly over Irish territory in Donegal. Now, if the Irish government had agreed to this, that would have been a breach of their neutrality. But in a secret deal, they allowed the Allies to fly through something called the Donegal Corridor, a strip of land across Donegal, and this allowed the Allies to get out into the Atlantic Ocean, and this was crucial in terms of winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Another way that the Irish government technically broke its neutrality in support of the Allies was when, after the Belfast Blitz, that's when Belfast was bombed by the Nazis, they sent fire brigades up to help try and put out the fires after the bombing of the city. Now that might seem like a logical thing to do, Belfast is an Irish city after all, but as I've said, that was technically a breach of neutrality, but the Irish government nevertheless went ahead and did it. Now probably the most important way the Irish government aided the Allies though was through intelligence. So Irish military intelligence in the Second World War shared what intelligence they had with their counterparts in the Allies. William Dunlea, the head of the OSS, that's the forerunner of the CIA, would recognise this at the time, and he accepted that the Irish government were essentially doing what they could to support the Allies. But probably the most single important piece of information that the Irish government would provide the Allies was a weather reading of all things. Now, in the summer of 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, they needed to know what the seas were going to be like around the coast of Northern Europe. The last thing they wanted was some storm to blow up and scatter the invasion fleet. And the way they found out that the weather on D-Day, the day the invasion began, was going to be good was because a weather reading taken in the west of Ireland in County Mayo was passed on to the Allies, and using this they were able to proceed in the knowledge that the weather was going to be good on that day. It might seem like a small thing, but it was crucial in terms of the success of D-Day. Now hopefully it's clear by this point that the Irish government, while adopting a position of neutrality outwardly, did support the Allies. But you might wonder, where do the oft-repeated claims that they supported the Nazis come from? Well, at the very end of the conflict, the Irish Taoiseach of the day, Eamon de Valera, did something that has perplexed historians ever since the 1940s. So at the end of the conflict, when Adolf Hitler took his own life in Berlin, Eamon de Valera went to the German embassy to offer his condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler. Now this was roundly condemned at the time, and pretty much ever since. No one fully understands why Eamon de Valera did this or what he was hoping to achieve. But rather than being evidence of an Irish government who supported the Nazis, it's actually quite the opposite. It makes no sense, precisely because right through the conflict, up until this point, Eamon de Valera and his government had largely pursued a policy to ensure an Allied victory, and it doesn't really make sense as to why he would then, at the end of the conflict, when Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany had clearly been defeated, that he would offer condolences, a move that only outraged the Allies. As I say, it's still not fully understood why he did this, and it was condemned at the time and ever since. Now, if you want to summarise Irish neutrality in the Second World War, there's no question the country adopted a position of neutrality at the outset of the conflict. But right through the war, at various steps, they took multiple actions to try and secure an Allied victory. So was Ireland neutral? Well, technically, but they clearly supported the Allies. Now, if you want to hear a lot more about this, I have a pretty long-form podcast where I explore this topic in really great detail. It's about 45 minutes long. I'll link that below this video. Finally, don't forget to ring the bell and subscribe to the channel to get the next video when it drops.